Good morning again, precious friends. I saw a video from Dr. Rob Sivas, who ordinarily I really like, and he spoke in pretty positive terms about this new stuff we're seeing coming around, lab-grown meat. Well, it's actually not meat, it's more of a slurry, a liquid, but it's animal cells grown in vitro, culturing cells very much like they would culture cells for experiments. But the thought now is that somehow this is going to eventually, someday, either replace or add to the type of or the amount of protein that's able to be made available by traditionally raising food animals. Some people are kind of making the point, well, we won't have to kill animals anymore, will we? Won't that be great? Not so sure about that. Animals will continue to die because of natural predation, but anyway. And there's some people who are saying that this will be better for the environment because, we won't have to raise cows, and everybody knows how farming meat is bad for the environment. Now, I would argue that there are some arguments to be made against farming chickens the way most chickens are raised, and there's a lot to be said about the way pork is raised. But I want to talk about specifically beef. It has been proven and categorically that there are ways to raise beef. And I would argue as well, sheep and goats. I think human beings as a group probably ought to eat more goat. That's beside the point. There are ways to raise these ruminant animals that are regenerative. It's been proven that there are ways to raise these animals and large amounts of these animals in a way that is a net carbon sink. So if you're worried about carbon, you can raise cattle in a manner that creates a carbon sink over their lifetime and over the lifetime of the marketing. This includes the trucking and the processing. So I'm not real sure about the argument that this lab meat is going to be greener than raising cattle or food animals for consumption, because there's a whole bunch of questions that I've never seen addressed in the literature that I've read. And if anybody knows about any, I'd be more than happy to read it if you would be so kind as to link it to me. Number one is cells don't grow by themselves. They don't grow without nutrient. What is this nutrient? And where is it sourced? Where does it come from? And what are the processes required to prepare the nutrient solution such that it is appropriate for the cell growth? Does it require processing? Does it require manufacturing? Does it require sanitation practices? And same questions that I would address to the actual cells grown in the lab. What are the sanitation practices required? What's the total green footprint of the manufacturing process? You would have to, I presume, keep the mixtures at specific temperatures during specific growth processes, during specific growth cycles. And then once it's been grown and harvested, I would assume it would need to be kept cold. And obviously everything would be required to be kept sanitary. What would be the sanitation practices? What kind of cleaners or chemicals would be used, and where would those cleaners be sourced, and how would they be created? What would be the net green footprint of the provision of all of the adjunct materials that would be required to produce this meat or these cells? What is the waste or the effluent from creating these cells? How would it be disposed of? How much of it would there be? Would it need treatment or amelioration in and of itself? Would it be an environmental danger in and of itself and require remediation or treatment, similar to a sewage treatment plant, I suppose, in order to be able to be disposed of or recycled? What would be the green footprint of that process? How much an industrial waste would it create? I imagine the sanitation facilities would require employees to wear special garments. What is the cost and the biological cost of these special garments? Can you just throw them away, or do they require treatment? Would you have to burn them? And in that case, would that environmental impact be factored in? These are all questions that the answers to them are simply unavailable, and I sort of get it, because a lot of this stuff is under patent, probably. It's proprietary information, and they don't necessarily want to share it. But until that information has been shared and made public, how can we as the public really trust industry to tell us the truth about this stuff? Industry, by and large, has not had a really good record of being transparent with regard to the costs and the negative aspects and the downsides of these wonderful new products that they put out. And yeah, some of them, to be fair, have turned out to be wonderful, and some of them, to be fair, have turned out to be not so wonderful. I mean, when I'm thinking about all the questions of whether this really is greener or better for human beings and for the environment, I can't help but think back to, and I'm old enough to remember this directly. I was there. I remember it happening. To remember the wholesale changeover in the 80s and 90s from incandescent light bulbs to fluorescent light bulbs. They used less energy and they lasted longer. And they used more plastics and less metal and less rare metals, so we were told it'll be less mining and it'll use less electricity and they'll last longer, so we won't have to make as many of them, and it'll just be so great. It will be much greener than incandescent light bulbs. And what happened? I mean, I can understand why they expected that it would be greener, but anybody who was around will remember what happened in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Yeah, it only took about 10 to 15 years for us to figure this out, that we got told, oh, be careful if you break a fluorescent light bulb. Oh, don't break them before you dispose of them. Why? Because there are toxic chemicals inside and you don't want them on your skin. So how do we dispose of these toxic chemicals? Turns out it requires remediation, and you weren't supposed to throw fluorescent light bulbs in the trash anymore. They had to go to e-waste. Requires extra processing. Processing requires energy. And then the toxic chemicals requiring remediation. You can't just bury them like you could just bury incandescent light bulbs. They would be fine. They would just munch down into almost nothing, and you might see the little metal bottom screw-in part, but eventually also that would rust away or or erode away. And it was mostly just metals that weren't particularly toxic, glass, and that was it. And some opacifying material that would be the inside of the light bulb, but that was generally something similar to chalk and not particularly toxic. So you could bury incandescent light bulbs. They would just crunch down to almost nothing after long enough time and weren't particularly a problem. But the fluorescent light bulbs became a toxic waste issue. They became a remediation issue. And eventually people, of course, started swapping over to LED bulbs, which on the surface of it seemed to be a better choice than either incandescent or fluorescent. Of course, that remains to be seen because we haven't been doing that for long enough quite yet. I'm expecting another 5 to 10 years will reveal whatever that happens to be. But if you'll recall, or if you were around, you'll remember that it didn't turn out to be any greener at all. In fact, it turned out to be less green and less sustainable than incandescent light bulbs. Live and learn. So this expectation that these lab-grown cells for protein is just a given because cows aren't involved. It's just a given that it's going to be better. I find highly suspect. And I'm not even going to call it lab meat because it isn't meat. It's cells. That's what it is. And it doesn't look like meat, and it's not going to taste like meat. And these cells, interestingly enough, if you think about it, these cells are not going to have any myoglobin in them. It's going to be gray sludge is what it's going to look like. And you've seen the jokes in the comedy movies about the future where people are eating squirts, just drinking glasses of gray sludge that's squirted into a vessel. Yeah, that's what they're talking about. Anyway, I refuse to call it meat. It isn't meat, not lab grown meat, nothing. It's not lab. It's not meat. Okay. And real meat has lots of things in it that this stuff won't have. This is raw protein. It's no better. It's actually might even be worse than, refined protein powders, except that we can grow the substances. And what are the nutrients? What are the nutrients that you're putting into these cells to make them grow? What is it? Where does it come from? Where are you harvesting it from? What protein doesn't just appear on its own out of nowhere. Amino acids don't. You have to put in amino acids and you have to put in an energy substrate. What is that? Is it sugar? In which case, there's only one place to get sugar, and that's from harvesting plants. Are we going to grow more row crops to create nutrient for these cells that are supposed to be the answer to food shortage? I remain stolidly unconvinced. Until all of this stuff is made transparent, I'm not buying it, and I have no intention of consuming it. And I've said it many times. If I'm forced to go live out in the boonies somewhere and raise my own meat, I'm not going to stop eating meat, and I am not going to stop eating animals, and I'm not going to apologize that nature created me a carnivore. Nature made me a carnivore just the same way it made a lion and a tiger and a shark a carnivore. And the lions and tigers and sharks don't have to apologize for predating on other animals. And I'm not going to apologize either. Well, that's where I'm at. I love you all. And despite what I have just said, I love all the animals too. We can all coexist on this planet. And the reality is, if it got down to the point where human beings started to have to eat other human beings' bodies once they were done with them, I could probably get used to that. I know it's kind of gross, but you know, if I die of ordinary causes and my death isn't anybody else's particular fault and my body is useful for nutrient, yeah, I might sign off on that. Just saying. Not that I'm recommending anything, but I'm just saying. Once I'm done with my body, this body just becomes meat. And if somebody else could use it, I'd probably be okay with it. Anyway, that's it. I know I've said some really, really, really controversial things, but that's okay. I don't care about being controversial. I love you all. Peace, love, and meat, even if it's mine. Bye-bye.